Some years ago in a Christian magazine, there was a story about a single woman who got tired of looking for Mr. Right. For years, she had tried to find a nice guy who would buy her roses and act like a gentleman, but nothing had worked. So one day, she decided to place an ad in the paper. I'm not sure how wise of a decision that was, but anyway, that's what she did. And the ad read, "Husband wanted." The next day, she was astounded that she received a dozen phone calls. However, all of them were from married women saying, "You want a husband? You can have mine." I enjoy reading children's responses about the world in which they live, the way they view especially things they pick up maybe from adults, or they maybe don't quite understand what an adult's saying. And so here are some answers I came across from children when asked about love and romance. When asked how love happens, Janet, a third grader, responded, "No one's sure how it happens, but I think it has something to do with how you smell." That's something that I've always told middle-aged boys when we would go to junior convention and I was watching them. Do you want to get married one day? Then you got to take a bath and smell good. Girls only like guys that smell good. So I would agree sort of with Janet. 9-year-old Roger, when asked what it means to fall in love, responded, "Falling in love is like an avalanche and you better run for your life." When asked how to make marriage work, little Ricky said, "Tell your wife she looks pretty, even if she looks like a truck." Another boy said, "Well, you have to find somebody who likes the same stuff. If you like sports, she should like them too, and she should keep the chips and dip coming." I think he's going to be in for quite a rough first year of marriage. A little girl was asked how to decide which person to marry. Her response was, "Well, you see, no person really decides before they grow up who they're going to marry. God decides it way back in the past before you get there, and then you get to find out later who you're stuck with." It's fascinating to me that in almost every romantic story, no matter what country, no matter what language, there are certain things that are universal signs of romance. Whether it's a romantic story in a book, a movie, or real life, there are certain things that everyone associates with romance. For example, flowers, cards, candy, chivalry, kindness, perfume, to name a few. Fairy tales are all about romance. The book of Esther has all the trappings of a good fairy tale. There's a beautiful maiden, a lonely king, a kingdom-wide pageant, and a stunning palace. I mean, this is the story of Cinderella come to real life. And as we dive further into our study of Esther, we find out that what's underneath isn't a love story at all, or at least not between a king and a queen. Rather, the only love in this story is between God and a prodigal nation. As the curtain closes on chapter 1, several years pass before the story picks up again. And so during that time, remember, King Ahasuerus has this big banquet. He is trying to convince his generals and rulers and leaders that they can go into Greece, they can take out their strongest competition. And so he's done that. He leads the largest Persian army to accomplish what his father could not, and that was to conquer Greece. Archaeology has revealed that after he conquered Greece, he planned to conquer the rest of Europe as well. Western civilization is grateful he was unsuccessful. The Greeks routed his army, demolished most of his navy. It's during this time period that the famous battle where 300 Spartans kept out all the Persian army for several days happens. They demolished most of his navy. And so King Ahasuerus eventually boards a ship. He sails home. He's sullen. He's depressed. He's disappointed, probably even disillusioned and stuff. And so he returns not as a conquering hero, but a losing king. And so we know historically kings had concubines as lesser wives. They also had wives of higher rank who could wear the crown at any time depending on the whims of the king. And so those whims and some misguided anger had led the king to banish his favored wife, Vashti. We looked at that scene last week. So now he returns home from a humbling defeat. We pick up in verse 1, "After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what he had done and what had been decreed against her." So now he comes home, humbled, and immediately he regrets his decision to banish his favored wife. The original construction of verse 1 implies that he blames his 7 wise men for his decision of what had been decreed against her. He was the one that decreed it. But he blames those 7 counselors that told him, hey, you need to banish her and make an example out of her because otherwise all our wives are going to revolt against their husbands. And they came up with that absurd, ludicrous solution to a problem. The king at this point is not in a good mood. His war chest has been depleted. His troops and ships have been depleted. His credibility and authority throughout the empire has been lost. I mean, his army was huge army was completely destroyed. And so his title, if you remember, he had given himself the self-proclaimed title. He was the king of all the earth. Well, the king of all the earth isn't king of Greece. He lost. And to top it off, he returns home to the dawning reminder, man, I banished my favorite wife. Man. So his 7 counselors approach him with an interesting proposition. If I was them, I might have gone to another country and looked for something else. However, that's not what they do. Notice verse 2. The king's young men who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king. Let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa the citadel under custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the women. We're going to start right there. So basically, they come up with an interesting proposition. Now, again, they have to come up with something. And so they come up with, oh, great king, why don't we have an empire-wide search, a beauty contest to find you another queen? What do you think about that? We may not think much of that idea, but to the Persians, this would have been unheard of, most surprising to them. Persian custom required that a queen be related to one of the 7 noble families. This would be unheard of. So what were these men thinking? Some scholars believe that the leading counselor, the one who had suggested that King Ahasuerus banish Queen Vashti to begin with, had a relative he thought or hoped would win the crown, and so he comes up with this idea. But they know also they have to come up with something. They are desperate for any idea that might work, and it needs to work quickly, otherwise the king's anger is going to go from being sad about banishing his favored wife and losing this great battle to, I'm going to take out all this anger on you. If you've ever worked, when your boss gets in trouble, what do they say? It all rolls downhill. And so when your boss gets upset, that probably means you're going to get a chewing too. And these men realize this. We got to come up with something. It's got to work. It's got to work quickly. And so the king needed a beautiful replacement for Vashti, or these wise men are done. They're going to lose these life. And so these 7 counselors go against every Persian custom or tradition. Normally, they would stringently defend those customs. We can't change anything. But they're like, you know what? We're so desperate, we got to do something. Forget this custom or tradition over here. Just don't worry about it. We got to do this. And so this was a Persian first. And it is a real Cinderella story in the making. And only a God as great as ours could use all this political intrigue, manipulation, corruption to pull off all of this. Verses 3 through 4, we just read them, spell out the plan for us. And so the citizens of Persia, this is amazing. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Anyone can become the queen. I mean, the talk in every town and village I could imagine is, who will win the crown? Think of Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory and the Golden Ticket. This would trump that for sure. I can imagine the crowds camping out for the arrival of the royal attendant and their announcement or their daughter's invitation to go to the palace. Women were watching their weights and fudging their age more than any other time in history. And why not? What would they get? What were they competing for? They were going to have the crown, the wealth, the servants, the food, the leisure, the clothing. I mean, the winner of this contest got it all. Happily ever after was waiting. Before we get too caught up in what looks like your average ho-hum, run-of-the-mill fairy tale, don't forget the reality of this contest. There's no way to whitewash what happens in this chapter. There's only one judge in this beauty contest, and every performance is private. Behind the imperial mask of pomp and circumstance that surrounds this pageant, there's the face of debauchery, lust, selfishness, and everything but love. The palace eunuchs were given the administrative oversight of the harem. They kept a close watch over the women because of all the drama, competition, and feuding taking place every day. There's over one scholar, I'll mention it in a moment, we'll look at it a little bit further. There was over 1,000 women in this contest. Most of those women, all but one, will never get past a one-night stand with the king. They will live forgotten lives, sequestered away in the palace. Now, they will live in luxury. They will have wealth. They will have clothes. They will have perfume. They will eat the finest food. They will have all of this. One commentator calls the harem of the king luxurious desolation. That's what's awaiting the loser. So finally, beginning in chapter 5, we start to see the leading characters appear. Notice verse 5. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. We're introduced, first of all, to Mordecai. We discover that he comes from a royal family dating back to King Saul. Indeed, he and his cousin Esther are descendants of what used to be the royal tribe in Israel. However, Mordecai's name bears no resemblance to his Jewish ancestry. In fact, his name is simply the transliteration of Marduk, the Babylonian god, the chief Babylonian god. And so that begs a couple questions. Why does a Jewish man from the tribe of Benjamin doing in the palace to begin with of this pagan king? Second, why didn't he return to Israel? King Cyrus had already allowed the Jews to go back to Jerusalem. Why didn't he go back with them, especially coming from the tribe of Benjamin? And then last of all, why was he named after a pagan god? Really weird. It's not like Daniel where he was given the name once he got there to sort of change his, to assimilate into the Babylonian culture. His father, a Jew, named him that. And so we may be able to find the answers to these questions through examining Mordecai's family history. If we went back centuries earlier, King David, when he's running for his life from his son Absalom, Mordecai's forefather Shimei, he threw rocks at David as David was leaving town, cursed him for stealing away Saul's throne. Later on, when Solomon takes the throne, David's son, he puts Shimei to death. And so perhaps Mordecai had heard this from his family. Maybe he knew all that. And so maybe Jerusalem represented, I don't want to go back. That's a place of defeat for my family. It doesn't remind me of good things with the family. His father maybe had absorbed himself in the Persian culture. Mordecai absorbed himself in the culture too. And he's so Persianized that he keeps his Jewish heritage a secret. No one knows that he is a Jew, and Mordecai intends to keep it that way. No one's going to find out. I want to pause for a moment here for some application. In the Persia that surrounds us every day, do you keep your relationship with Christ a secret? Does anyone know that you're a believer? I've heard and thought myself, I'm not very good at talking about Christ, so I'll just live it. I was given some years ago when I was in Bible college a quote from St. Francis of Assisi, preach the gospel every day, if necessary, use words. I get the meaning behind that. I mean, our lives do have to match up with the Word of God. We can't say that we know Christ and then what our decisions and our actions go completely contrary to what His Word says. We got to match up. But have you ever thought, has anyone in here ever led someone to the Lord and all they did was watch you? No one can be saved only by watching us. If people don't know the reason why we live the way we do, who gets the credit? Man, Phil must be a good guy. Look at him. He's kind. He just helped me. He's gracious. If they don't know the reason why I'm kind and gracious. Matthew 5, Jesus tells us, let your light so shine so that people will see your good works, glorify your Father in heaven. How are they going to do that? We've got to give glory to our Father in heaven with our mouth. We've got to let people know this is the reason why I'm making this decision. This is the reason why I'm making this different decision that seems to go against culture over here. Because I want to honor my Heavenly Father. And then when people make that connection, oh, it's from God the Father, and then God gets the glory for it. And then not to mention Romans 10:17. Faith comes by watching someone else live the gospel. I think there's like 3 of you that got the fact that that's not right. Faith comes by hearing the Word of God. It's got to be spoken. It takes a messenger willing to deliver special revelation to someone in order for that person to be saved. Don't be like Mordecai in Persia. Don't hide your light under a bushel. I got to do it. No! People need to hear the gospel, and you can give it to them. Now, back to our story. For the first time, we're introduced to the leading character, Esther. Verse 7 again, he was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. This time, we're given her Hebrew name, which references the myrtle bush, and her pagan name, a transliteration of Ishtar, the Babylonian goddess of love. And so evidently, Esther was orphaned at childhood. Mordecai, 15 years at least older than her, adopted her. He adopted his niece as his own. There's every indication from some conservative commentators, that he changed her name himself, perhaps. We don't know that for sure, but we're finally introduced to Esther. Notice one of the first things that described about her. She had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. So then we see this lavish contest. Mordecai hears the talk around the campfire. He hears the talk about the campfire around this contest. He sees all the people in the streets, and he realizes, Esther, my niece, is pretty beautiful. He's probably been driving away suitors for years. Now there's an opportunity. I can cash in on my niece's good looks. He can use her beauty as a means to his success. Notice verse 8. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa the citadel in custody of Hegai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace, put in the custody of Hegai, who had charge of the women. I'm not exactly sure what Mordecai is thinking at this point. There's at least 3 good reasons why Esther shouldn't have a chance at winning this crown. First, she's an orphan. That means there are no family connections. There's no special inn or someone to whom she can go to get all the secrets of how to catch the king's eye. There's absolutely no family connections. Secondly, she's just an ordinary peasant girl. She was a woman no one knew. Second, there's the sheer amount of competition. Josephus, the first century historian, wrote of this contrast attracted over 1,000 young women. One of the higher numbers I saw in my study was over 1,400 young women. You're talking about a tremendous competition. Esther wasn't the only beautiful woman there. She wasn't the only one. The palace was full of them. And then last of all, she was a Jew. The Jews were members of a defeated nation. While they had adopted Persian customs and been assimilated, they were not considered Persians. And so if this news leaks out that she's Jewish, her slim chances of winning are down to nothing. That is why we read this in verse 10. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her to not make it known. Basically, Mordecai is saying, look, Israel is in the past. God made you a Jew. Our fathers served him. But you know what? All of that's going to do you no good here. Here in Persia, you have to look out for yourself. And so Mordecai implies that once Esther reaches the king's court, once she's in that place, in that competition, I can't help you anymore. You're by yourself. You're going to have to find a way to manage everything yourself. Mordecai couldn't be more wrong. We just saw 3 reasons why Esther has virtually no shot of winning this contest, but we're about to see God work behind the scenes to guarantee her winning. The first thing God does is give her favor with everyone in the palace. Notice verse 11. Let's see. Verse 9. We're told that the young woman, Esther, pleased Haggai and won his favor. He's the person in charge, the chief administrator of this contest. She immediately pleases him. She immediately wins his favor. She won him over. It's the same word used of God's covenant favor and kindness with his people. Verse 15, we're told that Esther was winning favor with everyone. Verse 14, now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. How can we explain that? Clearly God is working. What we should be reading is that everyone despised her. Her competition was envious of her, or they were plotting against her. I mean, this is a competition. And not just any competition. The winner of this gets to become the queen. They're all in it to win it. Do people normally win favor with their competition? If you're at the Miss USA pageant, does everybody, just hold hands for who they think is the most beautiful person and root them on to victory? No, they're plotting behind the scenes that how can I take them out? What can I do to win this contest myself? Yet Esther was winning favor with everyone. We cannot overlook the fact that God may be invisible, not even mentioned here at all, not even implied in the text. But we can see that while God may be invisible, He is involved. Going up to verse 9, she wins favor with the chief administrator. He quickly provided her with cosmetics, her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Within a matter of hours, she has her own private suite. She's given 7 maids, plenty to eat and drink. Mordecai is not in the same situation. Notice verse 11. Every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was. He's a nervous wreck, biting his fingernails. Man, what am I doing? There's too much competition. Why did I do this? She's never going to keep that secret. There has to be something that I can do to make this work out in her favor. What Mordecai fails to understand is that God is already working in her favor without his help. Mordecai hasn't yet realized that it is God who is sovereign over Esther's life. While he paces nervously around the building, planning and thinking and planning, he has no clue that Esther is being pampered. She's not queen yet, but she's being treated like one. Notice again verse 12. When the turn came for each young woman to go in to King Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments for women. I thought Tiff and Ellie took a long time to get ready. A year for their beautification. What was taking so long? Well, the oil of myrrh would have been used to soften and lighten the skin, and since most of these women worked outside, their skin would have been dark, calloused by the sun. And to the Persians, fair skin was a sign of beauty. So it would take around 12 months of therapy and lack of sunlight to soften, lighten the complexion of these women. All of these cosmetics that are mentioned here were fully developed forms of makeup as a means of sanctification. The priests in this region developed and practiced the science of cosmetics because they saw the physical as merely a gateway to the spiritual. They truly believed that cleanliness was next to godliness. If you wanted to get closer to the gods, little g, then you needed to be clean and beautiful. And in a matter of months, these women would be led before a self-proclaimed descendant of those same gods, the king of all the earth. And so along with this beautification process, the women were also being schooled in court customs and royal etiquette. One scholar notes they were learning what to say and how to say it. Many of these women had come to the palace from the fields. Many of them never been in school, were illiterate, untrained, but they were beautiful. And so in 12 months, one of them would sit on the throne as queen. So this 12-month process was a crash course. This is how you look like a queen. This is how you sound like a queen. This is how you eat like a queen, smell like a queen, act like a queen. At this point in the story, there's no record of Esther saying, okay, I don't want to eat the king's meat because it's unclean. I'm not going to drink his wine, unlike Daniel before her. She's taken it all in. We see here that she's a character with not a lot of character at this point in the story. She's going to keep the secret of her Jewish heritage secret, no matter the cost. Moving on to the next scene, we see the fact that the queen is crowned. The next scene, I wish there was a way that I could pretty it up. It's not possible. Verse 13. When the young woman went into the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in custody of Shagaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go in to the king again unless the king delighted in her, and she was summoned by name. One scholar describes this contest becoming nothing less than a sordid meat market. Esther will lose, and these thousands of women will lose their virginity to a pagan Gentile along with over 1,000 other young women. Only one's going to be chosen. Among the 100 verses that Jewish rabbis added to the Greek translation of their original text, they include prayers to God from Esther about how she hates everything about this scenario. She hates all the pomp and circumstance of the kings and the royal court. She hates having to eat all the food. She hates having to go into the bed of this foreigner. Obviously, this is an attempt to try to clean up the story here, make it a little more palatable. After all, Esther's in the line of Jesus. There's a lot of things here want to keep her on the heroic side. Some evangelical scholars attempt to do this. Verse 16, it says that when she was taken to King Ahasuerus. See, she went against her will. Well, it's also the same word that's used that Mordecai took her as his daughter. It simply isn't true. As unfortunate as it sounds, Esther went willingly. She looks her best. Her mind is filled. Again, those 7 maids, they lived in the palace. They knew the secrets. The chief eunuch also is like, hey, you need to do this. And if you do this, the king will like it and you'll win. Notice verses 16 and 17. When Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women. And she won grace and favor in his sight, more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Winning the crown seems like he should, all right, Esther, let's go, at that point in the story. It seems a little anticlimactic, right? She won. She's now Miss Persia, so to speak. She's now the queen. You sort of really can't get excited about it. Was it worth her virginity? Was it worth her integrity? I couldn't help but think of the scores of young ladies over the years that have sacrificed the same to their boyfriend who said, if you love me, you will. How many professionals keep their faith a secret so it didn't get the way in the climb up the social ladder and the promotion at work? How many believers keep their relationship to God hidden because they want to go along with the Persians? Now I realize almost all of us here can't relate to a contest. None of us have, are not in this situation right now. Phil, why are we talking about this? Well, number one, the Word of God has it here. But I also think there's a principle we can draw out, as we'll see momentarily, of what to do to handle those facts when it's your child that makes that decision. Grandchild, family member, friend. I think there's some lessons we can learn, we can pull out as we see God working in Esther's life that I think can encourage those that are maybe going through that, dealing with that, and be able to share some of God's goodness, even if He can use that. So at this point, Esther might have gained the position of queen, but she didn't gain a husband. Verse 17 tells us the king loves Esther more than the other women, but he still loved them. The king does, I have chosen Esther. Now every woman in the harem can go. I release all my wives and concubines. No. Also, further reinforce that fact, verse 19, when the virgins were gathered together a second time. Why is there a second time? Shouldn't the contest be over now? The contest this has nothing to do with the contest. It has to do with the king's ever-expanding harem. Esther will occupy the place of queen, but she's not the sole occupant of the king's bed. Her role will not allow her even unhindered access to his bedroom. She won the crown, but she didn't win a close, honest relationship. That doesn't sound very good, but it would have been a lot worse for her had she lost. Verses 13 through 14, we read those moments ago. She would go in the morning she would return to the second harem. Basically, she would return a concubine and would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. Women who would come in as young women, leave concubines, relegated to a life of luxurious desolation, only to be called if the king happened to remember their name. This king, though, is not in the habit of remembering names. He adds names. God, in His grace, put Esther at the front of the line. Out of all of those thousands, the king remembers her name. He remembers her. This reveals to us that God works through faithful people. We understand that. We get that. That makes sense. This story in Esther reveals to us that God works in spite of unfaithful people. There's nothing that can stop God's providence. He sheds His grace on us, and it has to be grace because we don't deserve it. And so this doesn't mean that we have a license to sin. Romans 5:20. Should we go on sinning so that grace may abound? No! Heaven forbid. God, there isn't a chance we would do that. God simply reveals the depth of His love. Even when we disobey, which is daily, God never leaves us nor forsakes us. And that's exactly as we journey through this story, along with Esther, we will find this dotted throughout her story. God's grace drenches her life. She's wearing makeup, put on perfume, but she's covered in more than makeup and perfume. God's kindness permeates the pages of her story from cover to cover. In spite of her disobedience, in spite of keeping her heritage a secret, in spite of her immorality, God turned the heart of that debauched old man so that He chose her. And later on, God uses her to save His people. Ahasuerus placed Esther on the throne. From a human point of view, that is correct. But God was the one who placed Esther on the throne. God didn't choose her because she was more beautiful or because He found her special in some way. For that matter, Ahasuerus didn't remember her name because she was more beautiful or because he found her special. Ahasuerus chose her because she was the one that God would use to bring about the salvation of His people. God was the one who gave her a rich Jewish heritage, and God was the one who placed her in Persia at such an opportune time. Why would God do that? Because he had made a promise to Israel's forefathers that he would make a great nation out of them, and that from them he would bring forth the Savior of the world. And so nothing, not even this king of all the earth, not even immorality could stand in the way of that promise. What Esther will learn is that when God makes a promise, he keeps it. Do you want to live this morning a satisfied life? Trust God. Trust God. You want to live a satisfied life, trust God. Don't hide your relationship with him. Trust that he's going to do what he says he's going to do. And also, feel, you know what? I've already messed up. There's still hope. Trust God to make that right, and trust God that he can work even in the midst of that horrible decision that was made. Trust God. Do you want to see God at work? We would all raise our hands to that. Yeah, I want to see God work. Then work with him. Co-labor with him. Do you want to make a difference in the world? Got a couple young people here. Do you want to make a difference in the world? Of course you do. You want to be remembered. You got a lot of ideas, a lot of idealism. I want to change the world. I want to make a difference. You really want to make a difference? Submit yourself to God's will. Let God do with your life more than you ever could. What God wants you to do, go at it wholeheartedly, whatever it is. Whether it's a mechanic, whether it's an administrator at Sunland, whether it's a pastor, whether it's a teacher, no matter an accountant, whatever it is, submit to God's will. And while you submit to God's will, while you're pursuing glory through whatever vocation to which God calls you, often when we think of God calling someone, we automatically think ministry. And I felt God call me to preach when I was in high school. I understand that. Tiffany would say that as a school teacher, she felt called to be a Christian school teacher. Some of you that are in nursing or whatever else. But we tend to relate those callings to ministry. Anything God calls you to do is a ministry. God can call you to be a mechanic. God can call you to be an IT person. God can call you to be a stay-at-home mom. God can call you to do anything. That's God's calling for your life. Find out what that is, do it, and then as you're doing it, let the world know that you belong to him. We often will drive for miles around once we find an honest mechanic, because people will say it's hard to find one that's honest that you can trust. And when we do that. Whether it's a mechanic, whether it's being a landscaper, and anything in the middle, let the world know that the reason why I'm the best lawnmower in the history of lawnmowers. I am the best diesel mechanic in the history of diesel mechanics. I am the best housewife in the history of housewives. My wife has that title, so everyone else will have to fight for second. Whatever it is that God's called you to do, let people know, look, I'm a great landscaper. I'm a great feller of trees, like Phil here. I'm not doing it because I really love cutting down trees. In fact, it's one of the reasons why I go to work. I don't go to work at Sunland because I really love talking with people. That is not why I go to work. I go to work so I can say the reason why I go to work and I do a good job and I try to make a difference is what I can is because I'm honoring God. God's given me that task to do, and I've got to do it to the best of my ability. And let people know, hey, I'm doing this not because I'm some great person, not because I'm ultra talented, not because I really love this thing. All of those things may be true, but ultimately I'm doing it for God. I'm doing it because He's in control of my life. We can get so focused, like Esther, on winning a contest and a crown that we often miss out on what God is doing in our life and the lives of others around you. Esther doesn't know how this works. Mordecai's probably happy. You know what? Hey, now I got an inroad right to the king. I'm going to go. I'm related to her. Everyone knows I've adopted her. Man, I'm going to ride her coattails. Esther had no thought of God as she goes into the king. Mordecai, as he comes up, as he hatches this idea, which if we're honest, if he was really looking out for Esther, he would have protected her from that contest. But as we're reading this and hearing this story, who's working? God. In the midst of, we can't even fathom the depths of immorality we've read so far in these 2 chapters. God's working. God's working in your life right now, no matter the circumstances, no matter what you've done in the past. All of that, God gives grace for forgiveness, grace for restoration, and can make something beautiful with it. I remember hearing sermons when I was in Bible college and high school talking about you can't miss God's best for your life. Don't miss God's best for your life. You'd hear testimonies of people like, God wanted me to do this, but I messed up. Sometimes that may be true. But God can make something beautiful out of the mistakes we make. And I'd like to go one step further. God knew what that decision was going to be. Sometimes it's presented as you miss God's best and someone who was supposed to get saved wouldn't. We're not able to do that. God's plans are not going to be thwarted. It may not be ideal from our perspective. It may be something else, but God is in control. There's hope this morning that if you have messed up, or maybe you're ministering to a family member or a loved one who's messed up, there's always the hope of grace. This story, this plan, Esther and Mordecai have no clue what's going on. And God is orchestrating everything behind the scenes. So at the right moment, the right person is in place, and He's going to use their life.